lot of visual images in here, like we'll start, and it's a bit like going to the eye doctor. I apologize. 40 years of visual poetry. So visual poetry is a subgenre of poetry that usually encompasses sometimes pattern poetry, sometimes concrete poetry, sometimes visual poetry. Nowadays, in the computer age, kinetic poetry. This is a poem by a Spanish guy and named Kurt from the 50s. I don't know much about him, but what I will hope to explain is it's an international movement that's been around for a long time. Going back to the 1600s, which is where the 400 years from, George Hehir, English poet, metaphysical poet, and you can see, as you notice here, it's shaped like Easter wings. The poem's called Easter Wings, and it's shaped like this to give the idea of a dove. It's about the Pentecost, which in the Bible, the dove comes down and saves people. Things changed drastically in the end of the 19th century. Stéphane Mallarmé, a French symbolist poet. You notice here, this is actually 2 pages with a gutter running down the middle. But he starts to looking at poetry as a way of not being linear. So you might want to connect the words that look the same. It was, the number, where to exist, where to begin, where to cease. Or it would be chance. And what he does is he disrupts the linear narrative of reading and introduces many possibilities. Taken to an extreme, of course, by the futurists. This is Marinetti has a poem called Poets Parole in Libertà, which means words and freedom. And if you look at, he's taken the words, the letters that we would see as letters, and we don't look through them looking for some kind of meaning, but rather we look at them. So we have like S's and snakes, M's and mountains. Taken a little later by the Dada poets. This is really fast. Did you know that's 20 seconds? Anyway, this is the Dada poets. This is Raoul Hausmann, and he took optophonetic poetry where you pronounce the sounds as you look at it as a score, which is also taken up later by people like John Cage or anyone who's ever done possibly done a Harbor Symphony. You can see that as well. Kind of boom. Now let's read this one together. Shall we start? Let's go here. Silencio, 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 silencio. So he's actually in Bolivia, but you'll see how this formation disrupts the reading narrative, and an only way to have silence is by its absence. So that's how that poem works. Happened at a similar time in Brazil in the 50s. This is one of the Campo brothers. You can't really read it here, but he's taken, in Brazil, a bunch of poets. They had a pilot plan for concrete poetry, and it was very political, and you can see it closely. Here are the bodies, woman one another, the moaning human. So a lot of it was happening in Central America in the 50s politically. Moving ahead to America in the later on in the 60s, Tom Phillips takes a novel that he found for 3 pence, and he takes it, and it's a 1872 novel, and he takes all the words out of it. I can't read that, but it says that. I'm myself a Greek engineer, probably having a lot of work on this guy, a guy whose name just dropped out of my head. But he takes bookwork, he glues them together and goes into them. He calls them autopsies, book autopsies. And they're very intricate and exquisite. They're big like fat books. And he doesn't add anything to the book. It's only through erasure, through taking things out and recombining. So this is another kind of poetry. In Argentina, Ana Maria Uribe, she was a poet who started off doing type poems with using her typewriter in the 60s. And of course, as things developed technologically, her poetry developed technologically. But she would call this a type poem. What she's really bringing, letting us think about, is that the letters themselves actually have other functions. So when she gets a bit fancier, this guy looks like my grade 3 phys ed gym teacher, Mr. Matish, who we were told was some kind of Hungarian gymnastics guy, but he would have come across in 56. But obviously, I don't know about that. But again, you're noticing, what does it deal with the eyes? Is it his testicles? What's he holding? Is it a strong man? It's kind of a funny looking image, but what it does, it calls your attention to how the letter I, which is in my name twice, also can have other kinds of functions as well, or other kinds of value. This, of course, they would recognize this by any chance. Hands up. Anybody? No. B.P. Nichol, Canadian poet, in the 1950s, the concrete movement, as I've said, was very international, and there was an anthology put out in 1960 by Marianne Saul, international anthology, and B.P. Nichol was featured in it. So Canadians have been on the forefront of this poetry for about 50 years now. Another B.P. Nichol, just look at this, just how incredible it is. I wouldn't say it. So again, it's kind of a spiritual nature of language, looking at how recombining itself in strange ways, or ways that are unfamiliar to us, that in fact open up a language that the reader, has a time to become an active producer in the text, rather than like a passive consumer. And there's your Marxism for the night. Edgar Rawlings does these are tarot cards. Again, this idea of chant. This is one of a set of 78 cards: form, rhythm, style. And again, the idea of looking at something very differently, and recombination, opening up to the universe and the experience of what could happen. Another Canadian, Donato Mancini from BC, If you look at this as a poem, it could be possibly 4 stanzas, like you would like a normal linear poem. But what does these stanzas mean? What do we see? Well, there's fish hooks, there's loops. How about the absence of space? The subject of the light verb is the name of the poem. What does that mean? Another Mancini poem. These things are beautiful. What's he making it up to? Look, we have perspective. Is it a forest? I can't remember the title of the poem right now. But again, he's used tilted up on their side E's or T's or F's, and he's created this forest. There's something about white noise is the title of the poem. But once we give the linear, the regular title to the image, we start to have another relationship. Derek Ballou, who's probably the biggest producer of concrete or visual poetry in Canada, a guy from Calgary, very active. I don't know how big this is. This is rectangle number 3, if you want to Google it. And anyway, he's taking like stamps, and he's taking things, very, very different things. Anyway, this is the final poet I'm going to talk about. Is a Brit who now lives in Belgium. His name is Helen White, and this is a kaleidoscope. So again, we've kind of gone with this idea of the futurists who want to have everything fast, back to the handheld kaleidoscope. These are beautiful, and each of these have words on them. And she's part of a Kiki Collective, which is a women's visual poetry collective. They're quite active. And I just kind of want to... Okay, well, tennis, anyone? I guess the idea is that the idea, and this is kind of where I was going, was that poets have reconceived language as a material thing. Not just something we look through to try to get at meaning with words. We don't read linearly. We don't put the words together. We read in gulps. Poetry of this kind, visual poetry, concrete poetry, asks us to bump our faces up against the words. Thank you.